Good day and welcome to this little clip on parliaments and lawmaking. If we consider parliaments to be the central elected lawmaking assemblies in a given country, on the face of it, their role seems very simple. They are elected by the people and they make the laws. If you start looking more closely, of course, as we do in this course, you'll see that things are much more complicated and also diverge a lot between countries. And some of the big questions to ask in looking at parliaments and their role in lawmaking are, for instance, how is a parliament elected? Another question is, how does the legislative power of parliament relate to the lawmaking powers of other bodies? And another thing to be very aware of is which powers does Parliament have exactly when it comes to lawmaking, and how are they curtailed? Well, let me say something briefly about each of these dimensions. First, the question as to how a parliament is elected. Well, in the representative democracies we study, there's general rules for elections. They are laid down in, for instance, the German constitution, but also in many other systems. And they hold that elections have to be general, they have to be direct, they have to be free, they have to be equal, and they have to be secret. So these can be considered general principles of elections. But then how does the popular vote translate into the composition of parliament, of the legislature? Basically, in today's world, there's two main families. There's majoritarian systems, and there's systems that rely on proportional representation. If we look at majoritarian systems, the idea is always that people get elected within a certain constituency and then from there on move up to parliament. In proportional systems, people vote directly and directly enter parliament. Now, within majoritarian and proportional systems, there's very big differences. One big question in majoritarian systems is, of course, okay, if someone represents a constituency in parliament, then how is that someone elected, or how are these people elected? What you often see there is, for instance, a first past the post system. So just the person who gets the most votes goes up to parliament. But sometimes it's needed to have an absolute majority. And there's a so-called runoff system that determines who goes up to parliament on behalf of a certain constituency. If you look at countries which have proportional representation, you also see a lot of divergence. There's countries, for instance, that have lists. There's countries that have simple proportional representation, like the Netherlands. You vote and basically the seats in parliament are divided by the number of votes in a country. There's also something called a single transferable vote system. And a country like Germany will have a mixed member parliament, whereas people cast two votes, one basically within a majoritarian system, so for their land, for their constituency, and the other which is allocated according to a proportional system of representation. Now, both systems, majoritarian and proportional, have advantages and disadvantages. If you have a majoritarian system, for instance, outcomes can really be distorted. So winners can be people who did not in fact have the largest amount of voters behind them. It also becomes very much of a winner-takes-all system. There's also a centripetal effect because people tend to choose more towards the outer sides of the political spectrum. On the other hand, such a system is stable and can really, in that sense, leave a clear choice to people. A disadvantage of a proportional system is, for instance, the lack of personal elements. You don't choose for someone who represents your district, your department, your state, but more of a general candidate. There's a real danger of fragmentation, which can be curtailed by thresholds, but still. And the fact that you often end up with a multi-party system leads to coalitions, and these coalitions in turn can lead to dilution. So if you have a majority system where the vote either goes to one party or the other, it's much more clear in a way, and policy outcomes are much more clear. Okay, so this is a bit about different electoral systems and the advantages and disadvantages of majoritarian versus proportional systems of election. If we look at the role of parliaments and lawmaking, another thing to be very aware of is that often parliaments, the central elected bodies, are not the only body to make laws. Now, how's that? For one, in many countries, there's bicameral systems. So there's not one body, as is the case in Denmark, for instance, but there's actually two. Often they're called an upper and a lower house, or the upper house is called the Senate. But next to the directly elected House of Representatives, if you wish, there's a second body. And the second body can have a whole different range of histories and a whole different range of functions. For one, in federal systems, it's often the body to really represent the subnational units, as is the case in the US or in Germany, for instance, in most federal states. It can also in a way be a remnant of feudal times, like the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. It can also in many countries serve as a kind of check on Parliament, a place to weigh things over again, a chambre de réflexion, a place where parliamentary bills are checked against the Constitution also, for instance. So often the second chamber in the legislature serves as a mitigation, as a counterweight against the directly elected House of Representatives. And then what happens if they disagree? There's all kinds of systems to work with that. So a bicameral system is one way in which the lawmaking functions of the House of Representatives are checked. Another way is, of course, the fact that in many countries, governments also propose bills and acts. Governments also have lawmaking powers and can be this often is subject to approval by Parliament, but governments do initiate acts. Another thing to be aware of is the degree to which in EU countries lawmaking also very much resides with the European Union. Of course, only for those areas in which the EU has competence in lawmaking, but if it does, this can override national legislation. And then there's all kinds of procedures by which the national legislature can indicate, for instance, that it feels that the EU has overstepped its powers. But if you look at the power of lawmaking, it does not reside exclusively with the House of Representatives alone. So those are a few general remarks about who gets to make the laws. It's not only Parliament, not only the House of Representatives, but often a constellation of different actors that together form the lawmaker. Another thing to be very aware of is actually what powers a legislature has when it comes to lawmaking and how these powers are organized for different types of laws. Generally in lawmaking, it's important to look at three different powers. First, there's the right of initiative. Who can put forward the idea for a bill? For instance, in the US, the president does not have the right of initiative. It really resides with Congress, and this is an important political power. Another political power is the right of amendment. So this is once a bill has been initiated, is it possible to amend parts of it and to propose amendments to parts of this bill? Again, something that virtually all legislatures have, but that's also something important in the relation between all those bodies involved in lawmaking. And finally, and crucially, there's the right to veto. If a legislature has adopted an act, who has the power to veto such an act, as is the case, for instance, with the US president, who has the power of veto. So these three powers and the way in which they are organized tell us something about the process of lawmaking and who has what power in different constellations. One interesting thing to always look at if you're looking at the powers of parliament in a given country is also, for instance, who has the power to approve the budget, to propose and to approve the budget. This is, of course, super important. Another thing that differs a lot, but that's also a key competence, is the power to declare war. Who gets to declare war in a given country? Is that the government? Is it one chamber of parliament? Do they have to do it together? There's very different solutions to it, but the power to declare war is obviously very important. Another very important competence, as we see in these days, is the power to declare a state of emergency. A state of emergency often comes with all kinds of extra powers to curtail human rights, to override other powers. But who has the power to declare the initial state of emergency? So in a way, what I've provided in this brief clipping is a checklist to have in hand when you're looking at parliaments and lawmaking. And the checklist is: how is the parliament elected? If you look at lawmaking, what other bodies are involved in lawmaking? And also which powers reside where, and very importantly also who has specific powers. Now we talk about representative democracies here, but it's also, as a final note, important to see that even in representative democracies, there's often a kind of safety valve to allow for direct involvement. And this safety valve is that of referenda. You have all kinds of referenda. Sometimes they're compulsory, sometimes they're optional, sometimes their outcome is binding, sometimes this is not the case. But this is a way to enable people to have their say, also in systems of direct democracy. All this to understand how laws are made and to provide background to the country comparisons that we'll be doing this week. Bye-bye.